Welcome to the budget debrief. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jeremy Harbour, founder of the Harbour Club. Hey, Jeremy.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm really well, thank you. You know, it's interesting times, and this is take two of our budget debrief. We did the same last year with you, and that was great. I think we had a lot of really great feedback. So looking forward to another session today with a whole new set of things to get into. Before we get started, for those of you joining that don't know Jeremy, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Harbour Club and what you do?
Yeah, so look, I'm an M&A person. I'm an entrepreneur by kind of background, and I just happened to get into M&A about 30 years ago because I was in an industry that was very acquisitive, and so I'm quite well known in a very small niche, and that's in the mergers and acquisitions of owner managed businesses. Now, obviously, a huge percentage of businesses are owner managed. You know, most businesses are small, and that's the space that I play in, and of course. The economic landscape, the budgetary landscape has a big impact on small business and employers. And so, whilst this is unsettling, it does create lots of opportunities. There's lots of opportunities to consolidate when everything's going great. Nobody thinks about selling their business. And then when everything's terrible, it's time to do something about it. So these things do affect us. I would say probably, although as you point out, I'm in Dubai. I lived in Singapore for 12 years. I haven't been in the UK for a really long time, and but I still do quite a bit of business in the UK, the US, Canada, Europe, a little bit in Asia, a little bit in Australasia. Actually, very little in the Middle East where I live, but yeah, I do have a bit of a global perspective on this and how different it is, these things are handled in different countries.
Yeah, which is I think is always really valuable, and I'm sure that you'll have some of your own members here today, and we got the chance to catch up back in. I think it was either September or October when you were last in the UK here for your 3 or 4 day event, which was great. So yeah, it's a great community you've got there. I think that's definitely something we share in common. So
Yeah, yeah, adding
okay,
value to our members.
yeah, absolutely. Well, that's really what we're here to do, isn't it? All of us. So okay, so with a whole raft of changes to get into, yeah, I'd be really interested to hear actually whether you think there was something that stood out to you from all of the things that came from last week's budget.
Yeah, I mean, look, I actually thought, Rachel Reeves had a horrible, horrible situation. I mean, the whole lead up to this, it was the most mismanaged pile of trash you've ever seen in terms of leaks and releases, and then the OBR publishing the whole thing an hour before she had to stand up at the dispatch box and deliver it, which meant no one was listening. Everybody was, screaming and everything. But I actually thought, considering the pressure she was under, she did a pretty good job of actually just getting through it and to use the vernacular, polishing the turd, because what she had to deliver was awful, but she managed to put a spin on it to make it sound half reasonable, which of course then makes you go back and kind of fact check a few things and then realize, no, actually it is complete shit. So,
Yeah.
but what's insane is and this is reflected in a lot of the polls, is this kind of bait and switch, because Labour produced this manifesto to get elected on, which made a whole bunch of promises, and literally line by line, they've now broken every single one of those promises. And it's complete bait and switch. It's somebody told you X and did Y. It's insane. And of course, that means they've now got record low approval on the economy, on trustworthiness, on leadership, on by every metric. It's like the worst ratings in history, and they're being pulled to the extreme left by Dave the hypnotist, Zach Polanski, with his "money isn't real, we can just make as much of it as we like" kind of MMR stuff, and then you've got the right of Nigel Farage saying, "Well, let's privatise the NHS" and all this kind of stuff. So you've kind of got this they're being pulled in both directions. They're trying to appease both, and of course, you can't appease both ends of the spectrum, and so they're just digging it, digging themselves in worse and worse and worse. And it's the funniest one I think is this. There won't be any taxes on working people, and then trying to get a Labour MP to describe a working person is like trying to get them to describe what a woman is. They just won't do it. They won't come on TV and tell you what is a working person. And then obviously they've just taxed the hell out of working people. So I think their definition of a working person seems to be somebody that doesn't work.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And actually, I think there was a huge petition. I don't know if you caught it this week, calling for another general election, and of course, they've come out and Keir Starmer's rebuffed it just with a sort of we're here for the long term. But a lot of unrest, a lot of people feeling unsettled, and I think for me, probably the people that came out of this the worst were arguably the business owners. The very lifeblood
Mm.
of the economy, whether you're a small business owner or a medium, or and perhaps to a lesser extent the large business owners, but certainly the SMEs, compounding what had already happened in the last budget and some of the effects that we've already seen take hold. The increased national insurance increase, and the reduction in the allowance, before you start paying NI,
Mm.
compounded now with some further minimum wage increases, which I think we were chatting beforehand, and you were saying with inflation as it is, it's probably right that minimum wage increases, and I agree completely. But nonetheless, a further kick in the guts, I suppose, for the business owners and the entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're really still healing from the kind of government switching off the economy in 2020, which created this huge gaping black hole in most people's budgets. Then the increase in interest rates and the increases in inflation have squeezed, most businesses to the point of popping.
Mm.
And so then the NI in the last budget, and then the minimum wage increasing now. Plus, just generally, the consumer sentiment is not great. I mean, consumer sentiment is not great. People aren't spending. So people's top line is already under pressure from the kind of the shambles that's going on. That's creating a downward pressure on businesses at the same time as all their costs are rising through the things that we've just mentioned. And it's worth noting that in the UK, over 90% of the private sector workforce work in small to medium-sized businesses. So if you look at the split of where people work, it's a tiny percentage that work in very large companies. And of course, very large companies' sole focus in life is to get rid of people. They will embrace AI. They'll make as many people redundant as possible. They're trying to get as efficient as possible. Whereas the small business market are the ones that can expand and can expand quickly. A small employer can go from 10 to 20 people overnight. A large employer won't go from 100,000 to 200,000 overnight. So the way to double employment is to have a really buoyant small business sector, and a dynamic entrepreneurial small business sector. And it seems that they're kind of, dicking around with tax loopholes and EIS and things like that as their recipe for growth, when really they need to get rid of all the red tape for small businesses, all the business rates for small businesses, create, economic zones or free trade zones where there's, no tax for small businesses. And that would really light a fire under employment. And ultimately that's what, drives the economy. But no, they're punishing them instead. And the problem is so many businesses now are portable. Why would you sit in the UK and have all that expense and everything else where you could sit somewhere warmer, sunnier, safer, and still have customers in the UK, but also perhaps think more globally about things. And that exodus happened after the last budget. They then signaled that they were getting rid of non-doms, so that got rid of all the rich people from London. They then signaled that there might be an exit tax. That accelerated more billionaires and people, other people leaving. In fact, Milan has been doing fantastically well from Labour's policy. Real estate in Milan is up 3 times. They've attracted ton. They basically copied our non-dom structure, but with a 200,000 euro tax that you contribute, and they're just getting all the London billionaires are now and centimillionaires are all moving to Milan. And in fact, the main shopping street in Milan has just overtaken Fifth Avenue for the spend per square foot. So they've Giorgia Meloni's done a really good job of deliberately targeting the people pissed off with the Labour government. And obviously, I'm in Dubai, which is another big net beneficiary, and is attracting lots of people, and they're just making it worse. I mean, there's a mansion tax, and their definition of a mansion is a, two-bedroom apartment in central London.
Yeah,
So
yeah, you really don't have to be a real mansion owner to be affected by that. It's an incredible threshold when you think about properties in the south and the southeast and London, particularly, as well as lots of other areas in the UK too. Where, as you say, you don't have to own a significant size property for it to
mm.
be worth that threshold amount. It really is crazy. Um, what did you think about the? I mean, again, slightly niche, and I suppose not, perhaps not on the radar for lots of business owners, but given it's a fundamental part of what your community are doing, buying and then selling at some point businesses, the relief has been cut, hasn't it, for something called EOT, employment ownership trusts.
Yeah.
Did you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is actually potentially beneficial for us because, I mean, in the past, the only competition for buying a business was, the people doing leverage buyouts. Well, they all got burnt to hell post 2020 because interest rates went up, inflation went up, et cetera, et cetera. So all the leverage buyout guys are licking their wounds and feeling sorry for themselves. So they're out of the market. There's also a whole bunch of people, we call them search funders, which are the people that create a company, raise a bit of money from their friends and family, and
Mm.
use that to go out and do deals. But they're typically following a traditional M&A model, like a MBA type model. And so they get this analysis paralysis when it comes to doing deals. They spend all their time going through endless due diligence, whereas what we do is we see opportunities and we leverage those opportunities to make the deal better. So whereas they will see client concentration as a risk that means they can't do the deal, we will see client concentration as an opportunity to do a better deal, and to not put so much capital into the transaction up front. So they were really our competitors. And then when the EOT thing became tax-free, suddenly management buyouts became a kind of third competitor. And now that's basically, although it doesn't come in for another year, I think, that's basically been blunted a little bit because now only 50% of that sale will qualify for the tax relief. So if anything, it probably helps our members a little bit, although some of our members are selling back to employees after buying these businesses, so it might affect them. But I mean, look, generally speaking, most of our members aren't paying capital gains tax. Most people make a conscious decision to leave when it comes to creating a capital event. We've got members who've moved to Gibraltar, the Isle of Man, Jersey, Malta's quite popular at the moment, Portugal, Dubai, Singapore. You name it, they will move there and then they will create their capital event and not pay any capital gains tax. And that's why I think the exit tax was interesting. I mean, I've got quite a few friends in Germany, and in Germany they have an exit tax. In fact, we have one very good friend who probably has about 20 million euros of assets in Germany. And she can't move to Dubai without paying a 7 million euro exit tax to the German government. And so I really felt that that was probably on the cards because whilst Rachel from accounts has absolutely no experience in politics, accounting, economics, or any of the things that she's supposed to have, she does have other lefty mates in other countries that she can hang out with at various events. Mind you, now we've left the EU, maybe we don't get invited to so many.
Perhaps not. Yeah.
And I was sure one of them would have sowed that seed in her mind, that perhaps you should have an exit tax. The only thing I can think of is that maybe Labour has too many donors who wouldn't want an exit tax. And so therefore it's been kept off the menu.
I guess that's quite often the case, isn't it? Sadly, but yeah, it's interesting. I think for me, other than the punishment of reduced reliefs on selling your business, there's also the consideration of business property relief when you pass away and you're leaving what you've worked hard to build to your loved
Mm.
ones.
Yeah, I mean this obsession with inheritance tax by this government is a really strange one, isn't it? They've really taken it to the nth degree, and you kind of feel there's possibly more to come there as well. That this is the foot in the door, and that they're going to come back for more, and they're going to keep focusing on this end of life tax thing, which is morbid obsession.
Yeah, well, and with the freezing of allowances until I think 2031,
Yeah,
if
I
I'm
mean,
not
look,
mistaken.
that's basically a tax. That's an income tax increase, isn't it? I mean, in every sense of the word.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a great
absolutely.
shame. I mean, the big one, I guess, for you guys has got to be the salary sacrifice thing, hasn't it? Because obviously, pensions are at the core of your business. Does it affect SaaS, or is it only on employee pensions?
It tends not to affect SaaS because a SaaS is unique in the respect that it isn't like a big multinationals corporate pension scheme, and you don't have to be a multinational, of course. But if you're a business employing tens or more likely hundreds of people, the salary sacrifice mechanism has been a very popular and efficient way of both the employee but also the business saving national insurance. And of course, they've set to undo that now, as we know. But for SaaS, you're talking about usually owner operated businesses, usually actually family units, typically husband and wife or partners, or a sort of close nuclear family, creating a pension scheme only for them. And the method they use to fund it is usually one of two things: directly employer contributions, which are not through a salary sacrifice structure.
Yeah.
So, still very much tax deductible for the business. For me, even more emphasis on the value and the importance of successful, profitable businesses paying contributions into pensions and ideally SaaS because of the entrepreneurial nature of it.
Is that treated as like a pre-tax distribution then, like a profit distribution, a dividend almost, or?
No, well, no, it comes off as a direct expense, and so you're netting down the taxable profit before you get to the distribution stage. So it's
Okay.
incredibly tax efficient for the business. And if you've got a business that's got, two or three owners, they've each got an allowance per tax year of 60,000, and in some cases you can mop up unused allowances. Actually, a SaaS is unique in the respect that if you've got a really profitable business and you've got, quite a large ownership structure, you can be paying hundreds of thousands of pounds in a single year, and it can all be tax deductible in that year. So you can make huge savings on your corporation tax bill. And then, of course, the money sits inside the SaaS and it's growing tax free. And whether that's investing back into your business and charging interest, or it's buying commercial premises, or it's doing any of the other entrepreneurial things you can do with the SaaS, the many decades of tax-free compounding on that money, plus the relief you got on the way in, really does make it such a no-brainer for SMEs in the UK.
Yeah, no, that's and yet that's been left untouched, and it's the employees they've gone after.
It is, yeah. Yeah, strange. I can't quite get my head around it. You would think if they were going to apply a change, they'd apply it across the whole
Yeah,
spectrum of.
and the 2000, the salary sacrifice 2000 limit is an annual limit, yeah, in the
It is,
tax in
yeah.
any given tax year. Yeah, I mean it's nothing, is it?
No, it's really not, and especially for those high earners who, are doing the right thing by
Putting 2 grand a
making
month
their
into a
affairs
pension or
more
something. Yeah.
efficient, saving more for the future, being less of a burden to the country in the future. They're now being penalised. So, it really is, in my mind, such a strange thing. But no, thankfully, SaaS is going to be largely untouched by that because it tends to be these owner managed businesses. I suppose they are owner occupied, aren't they? Working hard to make it work. But for me, that's the biggest thing that a business owner could consider at this point, because we haven't even got to the increased tax on dividends yet. And of course, that's the second kick in the gut for business owners, isn't it? Is pension contributions or any other way that you can get your corporation tax bill down and simultaneously not have to pay tax on as much drawing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. Dividends is another area that's been attacked. I mean, just basically any other forms of income, whether it's from your savings, rental properties, like all of that stuff they've gone after. I mean, national insurance on rental properties, I think was one of I can't remember what she's adding national insurance to all sorts of things. I mean, national insurance is a scam. It's supposed to be a pension contribution, but it just gets spent on all the usual shit that government spend on. So it really is an income tax. And the only reason that they separate national insurance from income tax is so that we don't have the highest rate of income tax in the world. Because if you added the employers, employees, and the income tax together, I think we're on 80 something percent right now. And they're arguing we should be taxed more.
Yeah, you've got to work pretty hard to earn any money if you're not careful, haven't you? And
Yeah.
you know, the tax-free day, I think, has always been around about June in this country, and that'll
End of
obviously be
July for a
squeezed.
higher rate taxpayer. Yeah. It's
It'll be squeezed even further, won't it? So, you know, it's, you know, I think the mechanisms you can employ now to reduce your burden of tax on the business, which is a recurring tax going out every year, right? So every year you make a saving is more wealth you're keeping, which means further on down the line is more wealth you're passing on.
Yeah.
And then anything you can do to, yeah, because I'm sure lots of business owners, and you might see this in your community, Jeremy, you know, are drawing out money from their businesses far more than they need to, but otherwise the only option for most, or at least their understanding, is to just leave it in the business, which means they're going to get taxed on it somewhere down the line.
Yeah.
I think for me, the
But
way
again, I see a lot of people. I mean, I see a lot of people actually leaving it in the business. I mean, treasury seems to be a really big thing. I mean, we're finding businesses that are doing, 500,000 a year that are sitting on 3 million of cash. So they've obviously been saving it, for a while. And it is this idea that if I take it out, half of it's gone, and I don't need it right now, so I'll just leave it there. And then, of course, business accounts aren't the best place to park money. And so, I think there's yeah, but then the other thing is, if people are looking to escape, if they are looking to move to another country, then they can realize it because, fortunately, we are still taxed on residency, not on citizenship. So they, you do have that freedom to go where you wanted and then take the money there, and on a tax-free basis. And you made a really good point, tax-free day, as I say, the end of July for a higher rate taxpayer. Just to put that into context for people listening, that means you work every day from New Year's Day until the end of July, and every penny that you earn in that period goes to the government. And then after that, you get to keep the money to spend on yourself and your family and the things that you want to do from your hard work. And I think most people wouldn't complain about that if they felt it was value for money. If you lived in a safe, paradise where healthcare was freely available, you didn't get mugged when you walked out the door, that everybody had your best interests at heart, but then you see them spending 10 million pounds on a front door for the House of Commons that doesn't even open, an automatic door that doesn't open automatically, and then they spend 1.5 billion on refurbishing the House of Commons, sorry, 25 billion refurbishing the House of Commons, when they spend 50 billion on an app that doesn't work, hundreds of billions on software that never gets implemented. And it's all going to these, consulting firms, these large consulting firms that just milk the government for billions and billions and billions of dollars on an ongoing basis. And it makes people angry, because never do they think about spending less. They only think about how they can possibly squeeze more out of people. It never crosses their mind. When you suggest spending less, they think it has to be austerity, and it doesn't need to be austerity. It just needs to be responsible. 500,000, I think on the u.gov website, they spent £500,000 rebranding, and all they did was they moved the dot up a little bit. So the logo is identical, and they spent £500,000 on it.
it's comical, isn't it? You couldn't write it, and if you were the CEO of a successful business, you wouldn't be the CEO for very long. Well, you certainly wouldn't be a successful business either, I guess, if you followed the same path as local government. But yeah, okay. So I think the culmination of more tax on dividends, more tax on property income, the stealth tax increases to the thresholds, meaning more and more people are going to get dragged into paying more tax every year, as you said earlier, is absolutely, bar the name, an increase on income tax, isn't it? In all but name. And I think it probably means people who perhaps haven't paid as much attention to the amount of tax they're paying or the amount of tax their business is paying now have to really sit up and pay attention, because there are things you can do, and we're not talking hugely complex, loophole based things you can do. We're talking relatively simple things, unless you want to do what you've done, Jeremy, which is take yourself off to a lovely new hot and warm sunny climate and live all the benefits of that. But for those of us that are here in the UK and at least plan to be here for the near future, if not the long term, then I think now is the time to start paying attention to things.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we're being a bit doom and gloom because it is doom and it is gloomy. It is a shit show, and it's a shit show that will continue for at least another couple of years. And I can't guarantee it'll get better then, because the way politics is going, it's probably just a different flavor of shit show.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I mean, that you can only play the cards you're dealt. And I've often described it as like the rings around the ropes around the boxing ring. That the fight, the entrepreneurial fight goes on in the space in the middle, and the ropes keep moving, but you still carry on fighting, and you just have to be aware of where the new ropes are now. And there are still lots of opportunities that come out of this. I mean, look, what we're going through now is a sort of consolidation period. It's an economic winter period, and the best thing to do in an economic winter is to consolidate your market. So it's a last man standing strategy. And the last time I saw this was in 2009. And in 2009, what you found was that you might have 20 competitors in your town, and there's probably only room for 10. So 10 of them are going to go. And so one strategy is you either try and outmarket them, outcut them, sack more people and try and hunker down and survive out the other side, or you acquire them all. And you start consolidating and buying them. They will never be cheaper than they are now because they're break even or losing money. If you add their customers to your business, you don't have their incumbent costs that go along with those customers. So you can, scale the business up. And so this is a great opportunity to consolidate sectors when those businesses are effectively at their kind of weakest and cheapest. And you don't get that, that opportunity to acquire assets very often. And the great thing is it's a buyer's market. Nobody is running around with cash trying to buy these businesses. So you can structure deals that don't require lots of capital up front. And if you do need capital up front to buy a building or buy some plant and machinery and stuff like that, you can do it through a SaaS with wealth builders. So you can actually have your SaaS support you with the physical assets in acquisitions, and you pick up all the operating businesses. And then as the economy recovers out the other side, because it is always a pendulum, you have something hugely valuable that you can sell and create a big capital event. And then you just have to decide if you're going to do that in the UK and have to look at all the tax mitigation strategies, or if you do what a lot of my members do and bugger off at the moment that the capital event is coming. But I think if this is the economic winter, that's the winter sport right now, is to either look at the industry you're in and see if that could be consolidated, by your competitors basically. Or if you don't have a business right now, maybe it's a time to buy a business and use that as a vehicle to consolidate some stuff. And by buying a business, you might feel you have more options from a tax perspective of things that you can do by expensing things through the business, or you using it to contribute to a SaaS, for example. So there's a few things you could do there.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I just want to pick up on a point you made there, which was, if you're not a business owner already, you could be. And I think probably there'll be people listening or watching this back that are probably feeling that it's complicated. I'm sure you could probably reassure them it's actually far easier than they think it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, for one thing, there's a lot of baby boomers that need to get out of their businesses. And a lot of them right now are thinking, they can't really see a clear path for the next 4 or 5 years that they'll be able to, that there'll be a normal environment to sell their business. Well, if you're in your 70s, that might be bearable. If you're in your 80s, it's probably pushing it a little bit. And so quite a few of them are just looking for a safe pair of hands that they can hand over to move on. But yeah, the key thing with buying an owner managed business, because they're very volatile assets, so you don't want to borrow money to buy a volatile asset. That's like mortgaging a house to buy Bitcoin. it might seem like a good idea at the time, but yeah, it's not a smart thing to do. So the yeah, the strategy is to create an asymmetric deal, an asymmetric risk profile to the deal. So effectively, you cover all the things that could be potential downsides, so that you're leaving room for upside. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We publish a ton of content on this to help people understand how to do it. So if anybody wants, during COVID actually, which was the last big economic blip, we put together this 21 to keep people entertained while they're sitting around at home. We put together this 21-day like email thing. So every day you get an email that has a bit of information and a video to watch, and it takes you through the whole process from start to finish over 21 days. And yeah, during COVID, we gave it away for free because it was to keep people entertained. And this feels like another moment in history where the economy's a bit screwed up, and it's about 21 days to Christmas, more or less. So if you'd like to get hold of that, then we'll get you the link, and you can have, yeah, for the next 21 days, you can get an email every day.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. Massive value there, and almost like Jeremy's festive, business buying advent calendar. Then I guess 21 days of little tasty morsels. I just saw something pop up in the chat. Actually, I know we're going to have a Q&A at the end. It sort of seems timely because someone was asking whether or not a SSAS could be used to invest in M&A. And it's interesting because I was, funnily enough, having a conversation with one of your members who I met at your event back in September, October in London. And we were talking about some of the ways that he could have potentially been using a SSAS to invest in businesses. And I know there are lots of different ways that you teach people, I don't know, maybe 17 from memory, but 17 different ways you can get into, have a position in a business. But at a very simple level, if there's a SSAS is an entrepreneurial tool. You mentioned property earlier. If you've got a deal where the business you're buying has got a premises, but you don't have the capital, on its own, commercial property can be a nice asset, recurring income, potential for uplift, far less work in many cases than residential assets. But, you could tap into value you've built in your pensions, or pay money in, get tax relief, and then use that same money to buy the property that you otherwise couldn't have afforded had it not been for the tax relief. But you give yourself an opportunity to buy the home of the business as well as buy the business. So that's one option. The other option is you can use a SSAS to buy shares in small unlisted businesses. There are some parameters, but broadly speaking, if you've got a couple of £100,000 worth of pension or more, you could be using some of that to buy the shares in the new company that you're wanting to be involved in some capacity or another.
That's interesting because obviously in SIPs that's completely forbidden, yeah?
It's certainly much more tricky. And look, SIPs have changed a lot in recent years. There was a time where SIPs were genuinely entrepreneurial and you could buy unlisted shares and you could lend money to other people. And those days are sadly now almost gone. And a SIP is really just a home for stock market investment in the traditional sense. And in some cases, far limited now, very vanilla commercial property transactions. What a SSAS allows you to do, and that's largely down to regulation, actually. The FCA, who regulate everything other than occupational pensions, pretty much in the UK, and some types of borrowing, have made it very, very difficult for traditional pensions to do anything even remotely entrepreneurial now. SSAS sits aside from that regulation. It is still regulated, but just by a different body who thankfully seems to be more relaxed about entrepreneurship. So, you can't really do this in a practical sense in a SIP anymore because no one wants to do it. With a SSAS, you're in the driving seat, you're in control, and you're determining within some predefined parameters what you want to do with the money. And if that involves buying shares in a new business, you can do that, tapping into capital that you haven't got in your life today because it's tied up inside a pension structure. and actually putting it to work to help you build wealth outside of your pension.
And what percentage of a business can a SSAS theoretically own then?
Well, it depends on how many shares you own, voting shares primarily, and if you're a director or not. But usually, if it's deemed unconnected, in other words, you don't have a controlling stake, that usually means you own less than 20% of the voting shares if you're a director, or less than 50% of the voting shares if you're not a director.
Right.
And that means a statutory director, of course. So if you're a non-exec director and you're charging a fee for some sort of consultancy structure, which I think, again, is something that a lot of your members are doing, then you can still have the same level of income that you would get from the business as a non-exec director, whilst being able to use capital if you need to put in to buy shares at a discounted rate or whatever structure you've been able to negotiate.
Yeah, so maybe providing the cash component of a transaction, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, and of course,
but theoretically only up to 50% with you not being a director.
Yes,
and 50% between you and the other SSAS.
There would always be a consideration about your shares and the SSAS's shares, and there are some aggregate limits that you have to pay attention to. So the 20% is an aggregate limit. So you wouldn't be able to own 50% of the shares in your own name and also purchase 20% through the SSAS, because they're aggregate limits, and that's because broadly the rules don't allow a SSAS to be in control of the business.
Yeah.
But
so anyone trying to do this needs a really good advisor they can call up whenever they need and say, here's the deal, how can I slice this up? Yeah,
exactly. And of course that's what we're doing for the members that we work with all the time, helping them think about, not in a prescriptive way, but in a almost like an analysis of the risks, the pros, the cons, and the different ways you can do something. Because there's normally more than one way to skin the particular cat. It could be shares, it could be a commercial property play, it could even be a loan. You can lend money from a SSAS to an unconnected business, and actually, even if you are in control of that business, you can still lend to it, because there's a very particular mechanism called a SSAS loan back, which is unique. It's the only thing that a SSAS does in isolation that no other pension can do, because it's carved out in the rules specifically for SSASs, is to lend up to half of the pot to that limited company. So if it's looking to buy stock or plant or machinery, or it needs to invest in its infrastructure or whatever it might be doing, doesn't matter. It can be a retail business, it can be manufacturing, it can be anything. As long as you can provide some security for the money that you are lending, and sometimes the security could be on the actual asset itself, the business itself, then you could, in theory, lend some money to your SSAS. And that can also be a collaborative thing alongside some shares, because the loan is just credit. The shares denote the ownership and the control, the loan doesn't. So in theory, it's possible that you could have more than one way of using your pension to get involved in anything you're doing with a new company or an existing one.
So a loan could it could lend to an SPV that then buys the shares in the target company.
Yeah, in theory, it could do that. And whether you decided to do that versus buying them directly is, usually comes down to things like cost, legal fees, and I suppose the agreement you've got with anyone that you're dealing with. But it can work quite nicely if you've got more than one person collaborating on a deal as well. If they've got the ability to use money that they otherwise wouldn't get. But also, let's not forget, the uplift on any sale in the future is now free of CGT, because it's housed within the SSAS, and you've effectively sheltered that gain from taxation. Which, given a large part of what you teach is buying and selling at the right time, if you can do it in a tax efficient way, it's got to be worth considering, I think.
Yeah, and that's all been basically untouched by any of the last two budgets.
Yeah,
because pensions seem to be a hot topic for them, but again, not SSASs.
Well, no. Do you know? I'll tell you why though. It's really interesting.
Did you have any sleepless nights in the lead up?
Well, you never know what's going to come, and of course, there's always a small part of in the back of your mind that's thinking, is it going to be used here as a political tool? But the number of SSASs in the UK actually is a very small number. It's the best kept secret for business owners. It really is nuts. And sadly, there are lots of professionals who could be talking about SaaS that aren't raising more awareness. But, there are probably less than 50,000 SaaSes. I think the last time the numbers were published, it was about 35,000, and that was some years ago. And you compare that to north of 1 million SIPs and millions of other pensions, it's a drop in the ocean. So politically, there isn't a huge amount of value to them just penalising SaaSes.
Yeah.
There was something that happened a few years ago where they were going to introduce a levy that would have ultimately killed pretty much all but the largest SaaS schemes. And thankfully, there was a lot of backlash and it didn't go through. But no, there's been no tinkering with SaaS in a sizable way for some years. And I think what a lot of...
Why do you think it's such a big secret? Because I mean, things, most things like this tend to get quite widely shared, don't they? I mean, I know some SaaS providers aren't as flexible as some of the things that you've explained you can do with a SaaS. I know not all SaaS providers let you have the full spectrum of advantages, and so I guess that might be part of the issue. Yeah, is that
it certainly is. I'd say there are two things. One, some SaaS administrators operate much more like regulated or FCA regulated SIPs. And what you tend to find, without casting any blanket aspersions over all SaaS administrators, is that the larger FCA regulated SIP providers who have a SaaS offering, but they don't really, it's not a sizable part of their business. They have it because they're filling a gap, usually, I suppose, because competitors have got an offering, they want an offering. But their biggest book of business, their driver is the SIP book. And they simply just reflect most of what the SIP can do into the SaaS. So it's really a SIP with a SaaS label on the front. The other point is, the reason I think that lots of professionals don't is there is a at least the perception of a complexity with SaaS, that it's also very expensive. It's absolutely not. In fact, SaaS fees by and large are linked to activity, and most other pensions are linked to value. So as you do a good job of building your pension pot, you're actually ironically paying more cost. Whereas with the SaaS, you're paying for a piece of work to be done. You're paying for annual accounts to be filed and all those things. And actually, it's pretty normal to be paying £2,000 a year plus that to run a SaaS.
Rather than a percentage of AUM.
Rather than a percentage of the underlying value. And if you've done a really good job of building pensions in your life to that point, you can easily be... I mean, I was speaking to someone the other day who had £1 million in a SIP. And, they're paying £5,000-6,000 worth of platform fees alone. And there are some low-cost options, but nonetheless, you're always going to be penalised if your value and fees are tied intrinsically together. And of course, where you've got a vehicle that charges fees for work, you could have £1 million SaaS and still be paying a couple of £1,000s a year to run it, versus many thousands of pounds in a more traditional setup. So this perception of high cost is rampant, but is largely untrue. This perception of complexity, again, if you can run a business, you can run a SaaS. Running a business and being the head of that business and making the key strategic decisions is no different to being the trustee in a SaaS and making the key strategic decisions. And in fact, you're wearing both hats. So actually, you've got the ability to look over the whole spectrum of your business and your pensions and see how they work best together. So misinformation, problem number one. Problem number two, there are some elements of the professional world where a SaaS would be counter to their own best interests. There are lots of professionals who get paid to manage people's money, and SaaSes by and large do not put all of their money into the stock market. They're entrepreneurial vehicles that want to do entrepreneurial things. And therefore, it's much more difficult for someone to tap in and take a percentage of your wealth every year compared to a standard pension where that's usually your only option.
Interesting. Somebody was saying there, I don't think it's a secret. I talk about SaaSes morning, noon, and night with all my friends and family. Is this your wife?
Yeah, excellent work there, darling. Thank you. Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's not something that, well, I guess tax conversations don't come up very much in low tax jurisdictions like this, although I guess we only talk about other people's tax and how annoying it can be and all the rest of it. So
Mm. Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
guess that's
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, So I think someone, again, I saw it on the chat, so I'll mention it because we talked about the dividend increase.
Mm.
We talked about the property increase, but perhaps for those of us in the session here today and those looking back who've got savings, savings interest rates, tax on savings interest is going to increase as well, an extra 2 pence at each level. So,
Mm.
back to the employees and people who are perhaps less uh, are more cautious with their money, and relying more heavily on savings. And though perhaps not a huge number of people watching this, but nonetheless, if you've got money in savings outside of ISA wrappers, these incremental changes can make a difference. If you can slash the fees on running pensions and investments, keep more of your money. If you can be more efficient and invest more in tax wrappers like ISAs, they've obviously slashed the cash ISA rate again to try and encourage people to invest in the stock market, but they're making it harder for people to save and get interest on the savings. But these incremental things can add up. This is not, if you've got to look at everything from the top down, and if you can make two or three or four or five incremental changes, suddenly you're making quite a dramatic impact in the longer term.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's and that I guess is actually probably the thing about this budget, wasn't it? It was lots of nibbles at, I wouldn't even call them loopholes. They were just areas that they hadn't fully exploited. And they nibbled into a few of them. And then I think very unpopularly gave it pretty much away in benefits and welfare. And I mean, it was interesting because it was clearly she's trying to save her, it was clearly an attempt to save her job because it only appealed to the backbenches of her own party. It's wildly unpopular in the country. I think there's a 70% disapproval rate in the
Mm.
polls to the increase in welfare and increase in particularly the unlimited child benefit kind of breed as much as you can and we'll keep paying for them approach. And yeah, so wildly unpopular, but incredibly popular in her own backbenches. And I think that's clearly, if there's a vote of confidence or an attempt to oust her, I think that was just her attempt at trying to keep her job. So it's politicking at everybody else's expense, which is also frustrating, and I guess another reason why people are a little bit angry.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. I think, the best thing people could do now is try and turn some of that anger into action. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, so is there anything, as we start to think about moving on to tackling some of the questions from some of the people listening, Jeremy, is there anything that you would identify, one or two actions that people could be taking from your perspective, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a broken record. My solution to every one of the world's problems is to buy a company. I mean, if you want peace in the Middle East, getting divorced, whatever it is, buy a business would be my answer. So I'm very predictable in that respect. But as I said earlier, I think the timing is optimal. So the first quarter of any year is always the best time for buying businesses. It's actually it's peak divorce rate as well. So
Oh, really?
everyone gets divorced in January, yeah, or starts the process.
Yeah.
And it's the same, it's almost like divorcing your business when you decide to actually let somebody else take it over. And I think it's that downtime you have between Christmas and New Year. It's a period where you're not working and you're with your family and you can discuss and think about these things and you make plans for the new year, where you might choose to do something perhaps slightly more drastic or take some action. And so Q1 is a great time to do deals, and the fact we've had this budget so late in the year, I mean it's unprecedentedly late in the
Mm.
year, does lead quite nicely into taking action in Q1 to be able to buy a business. The other thing is obviously, and this is an observation actually about both budgets. they love putting everything in the distant future, don't they?
Mm,
We're going to do this, but it starts in 2027. And it's quite clever because you think, oh, that will never fucking come. 2027, it's like, Jesus. It's like,
yeah.
isn't that when Star Wars was filmed or something? You know, it's so
Yeah.
you just think it's so far in the future it could never possibly come. And so you actually see this in all the OBR stats that basically everything is completely screwed for the next 2 years and then kind of gets a little bit better in, later on. And of course, all of those forecasts are, never ever right. I mean, they're always, wrong, sometimes by quite large degrees. And so I think the further out they push it, the harder it is to forecast. And so they just have to take a view, well, I guess if you got more money, everything's going to be better. So we'll just make it look better in 3 years' time. And so I think, April is the tax year. So, people that do want to leave the country, it's a really good idea to change your tax status before the beginning of a new tax year. Otherwise, you have a whole nother tax year that you have to wait. And there's a form on the HMRC website that you just fill out. It's the I don't know how to put this politely. The I fucked off form. I've left I've left the building form.
So
And of
long, farewell. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And of course, when you fill that out, you don't have to leave straight away, but you can leave, but you can fill it out basically saying that you've left and then get a TIN, a tax identification number from somewhere else before April. So whether it's, all I mentioned a bunch of places, could be anywhere in the world that you get your new tax identification number from. And then basically, yeah, you then can only spend 90 days in the UK from April onwards each year. And of course, look, that's a super drastic action, but if it is something that you discuss over the Christmas dinner table and you take it seriously, that's the sort of timeline that you're going to be working to. And then I think if you're not, buy a business, while they're cheap, get them while they're cheap. Buy a business, use that as a vehicle to target other businesses in the same sector. What you'll find is that if you buy a business in a particular sector, you suddenly become attractive to all the other competitors in that space because they think, fuck, I'd like to get out of my business too. I'd like to retire. And he obviously knows everything about this industry because he just bought a business in it, even though it might be your first foray into that particular sector. So you'll become immensely attractive to all those other business owners. You can, if you're committing the labor sin of making a profit, you can contribute that to a SSAS before, so that you don't pay corporation tax, and then you could use that SSAS to buy real estate, lend money to yourself, lend money to businesses that you're dealing with, support you in buying other businesses, etc., etc. So you could provide a good kind of working capital kind of approach. So yeah, if you're staying, I think if you're leaving or staying put, buy a business, but also over the Christmas dinner table, maybe have that discussion about leaving or staying put.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. I suppose the only thing I would add to that is I would echo absolutely your point about, be more tax efficient with profitable businesses, make pension contributions, seriously consider a SSAS. And if you're not a business owner already, but what Jeremy has said has resonated with you, then, buying a business then immediately gives you the eligibility criteria to have a SSAS. So whether you're already a business owner and SSAS could be something you consider to get you into business or not, or you're going to get into business and you like the kind of thing that Jeremy's talked about, SSAS can then follow on later down the line, and that can then help you accelerate acquisitions and accelerate your wealth. I think the other thing I would say, and again, Jeremy, you mentioned it earlier, this obsession with death taxes is manifesting itself in almost every area that we look at. Pensions are going to fall into the IHT net in April 27. Tax on the death of business owners is now being, the reliefs are being slashed. And now is the time for people who are doing a good job of building their wealth or have got big aspirations and know that they're on the right trajectory to really get clear on what do they need to do, what tax, legal and structures do they need to make their affairs in the UK, assuming they're not already on, TripAdvisor booking a flight to, somewhere hot and sunny. What do you need to do? Build a plan. And of course, that's a big part of what we're really helping people to think about now.
Yeah, I think people are just too reactive to stuff, aren't they? It's like I was saying, April's the year. You need, if it is something you want to do, you need to do it before April. People don't think like that. They get into May, June, and they go, right, I'm selling this asset, and then yeah, it's like they find themselves, running around trying to retrofit where they are to where they want to be. Whereas if they just thought about it a little bit in advance, life would be a lot easier.
Yeah, yeah, it absolutely would. Okay, right. So I'll be the question master then, Jeremy. We've got a few for you straight away. I'll select a few to get us started. First of all, Rami has asked, what are your views on the current and future position of M&A? Also, where is the market growing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, the M&A market that gets reported in the news is obviously when the world's largest brewer buys the world's second largest brewer, and those kind of M&A deals are actually put together by two teams of advisors. They then go to the board of directors for approval. They then get signed off by shareholders. It's very, very different to buying an owner-managed business. And as I was explaining at the beginning of this presentation, most businesses are small. Most businesses are owner-managed businesses. So you have to kind of understand the process and the psychology of dealing with those type of business owners versus that advisor-driven kind of acquisition process. So interestingly, we're seeing most of the deals we're seeing are in the business services space. And I would say there's probably a slight weighting towards blue collar services. So, engineering businesses, kind of, the stuff you wouldn't wear a suit to go to work and the rest of them will be the white collar services, so marketing agencies and those kinds of things. I mean, the last business I bought was a railway engineering business. The one after that is, yeah, so one blue collar, one white collar. The one after is in the music industry. So, but yeah, we're seeing a slight weighting towards that blue collar stuff. But what you see is that a lot of those businesses just aren't transacting. If you speak to the business brokers, only about 8% of the companies that are put up for sale are actually selling. There is a very, very tight market when it comes to selling businesses. But what's interesting is as businesses get bigger, they become more sellable. So one of the biggest drivers for the saleability of a business is actually scale. And so you'd think it was, technology or solving some unique problem, but actually they just need to be big enough for people to invest in the due diligence and the fees that all the advisors charge to do a deal. Yeah, I mean, obviously the 100 million plus enterprise value, there's always a buyer. But when you get down to these, SMEs doing sort of 1 to 10 million of revenue, there's hardly anyone in that space. So it's kind of blue ocean, lots of opportunities there.
And that's the real sweet spot then, by the sounds of things. And
Yeah.
do you think the AI or the reason why blue collar tends to be something that is growing is because it's less impacted, less likely to be impacted by AI?
I think I don't think that is the reason. I think it's a really good observation because I think people are thinking in terms of what's Amazon proof, what's AI
Yeah.
proof, these kind of things. But actually, I think it's because one, they're a bit less sophisticated, so they don't tend to have a data room, all of their accounts in Zero or cloud accounting system. So they're not really kind of seller ready. They're sticking a nanny through the accounts, this kind of thing. The white collar ones are sometimes a bit more sorted in that respect. They're a bit more mature in terms of how they present themselves. And so that lack of sort of professionalism puts off a lot of the professional buyers. So it's very hard to do an LBO on a business that hasn't got a proper setup because the bank will want to do its due diligence and they just can't when everything's all over the place. So yeah, I think it's more a lack of sophistication and then on top of that, the scale. These are subscale businesses from an M&A perspective.
Okay.
But
All
AI
right.
is having a huge impact. I mean, we're seeing the impact of AI on sourcing, the impact of AI on due diligence and people looking at businesses. But yeah, I mean, we saw a huge trend over the last 20 years of people digitizing businesses, so buying businesses that were still using bits of paper, getting them to use, software. And AI is now the next level of digitization, but there's still businesses out there that are still sticking invoices on spikes. So you've got, all it means is there's now still, there's just an even bigger leap that you can take with these businesses in terms of enhancing their efficiency.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, thanks. So there's a question here from Shazad, and Shazad is asking, it's a SaaS question, can a SaaS be utilized to invest in foreign property? And the answer is yes, it can, but it's trickier. So, in theory, a SaaS can buy an asset in any jurisdiction in the world, but the practicalities of the way that a SaaS is structured, it's based on a trust deed. So trying to buy an asset which is based on trust deed and rules in a jurisdiction that doesn't acknowledge and understand trust law is very, very, very complicated. So the real life answer is yes, you can, but it has to be in a jurisdiction that recognizes trust law. And of course, there are large parts of Europe, let alone elsewhere in the world, that don't. But there are lots of jurisdictions that do.
So ideally, a Commonwealth jurisdiction, yeah, like
yeah,
Canada
exactly. And the other thing, I suppose, would be that it still has to be land or commercial property. One of the only thing that a SaaS can't really do is invest in a habitable residential dwelling or invest in things that are tangible and movable, cars and boats and wine and antiques and all those things, all the fun stuff. But it can invest in land of any kind. It can invest in a myriad of different properties that are commercial, including things that on face value may look more like residential. And by that, I mean things like supported living, care facilities, that kind of thing. So the answer, Shadad, is yes, it can, but it would always be dependent on the jurisdiction and its application of trust law or not. Okay, so Emre's got a question here for you, Jeremy. What happens with the deferred element when a deal is in place? If a deferred element is, say, 100,000, is this 100,000 of debt to the owners that goes on the balance sheet, or otherwise, how's it treated?
Yeah, so typically when you buy a company, you create an SPV, a special purpose vehicle. So it's just a limited company that you're going to use for the transaction so that the contracting party is a limited company. The deferred payment sits as a debt on that SPV. So it's not on the actual company that's been acquired. The company that's been acquired is a wholly owned subsidiary of that SPV, but the debt sits on the balance sheet of the SPV and is repaid to them over a period of time. That's the normal way that we structure it. I've seen it structured in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes, by the way, when you sell a business with deferred payment, it triggers the capital gains tax on the entire amount. So not just as you pay it. And so some people don't want to have a debt for the whole amount sitting on a balance sheet somewhere because they'll pay all of the capital gains in one go. So I've seen lots of structures where new loan notes are issued every year, and it's agreed that a new loan note will be issued every year over, say, 5 years in order to pay it. So the loan on the SPV, you'll only ever see 1 year's worth of debt at a time. So in order to optimize the capital gains tax from the other party.
I think that for me is the exact reason why, if you want to get into buying businesses, you need to know what you're doing, and you need to be able to call on someone who can tell you all these super clever techniques, things that you wouldn't even necessarily need to think about or know to think about until it's arguably too late. Okay, perfect. Right, so next question. So this is from Lily, and Lily asks, can you use a SaaS to buy the plant and machinery in a business or via the loan back method? So the answer to this one, Lily, is I literally just touched on it. As it happens, I was mentioning there that there's only two things a SaaS can't own, and one of them is tangible movable objects. Now, I know there's a certain irony to that, given that certain pieces of plant and machinery weigh many, many tons, and you couldn't move them even if you wanted to without a huge amount of work and other machinery. But and weirdly, even the massive wind turbines, God knows how many tens or hundreds of tons those things are. The revenue still categorise those as tangible movable objects, whether you can believe that or not. So the answer is simply you couldn't buy them directly. but you could lend money through the loan back method to your limited company, and the limited company could use those funds to buy the plant or lease it, potentially, depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, and we see quite a few harbour clubbers creating asset companies and operating companies. And so, I talked about having an SPV. The SPV buys the target company. You might have a second entity that buys the plant and equipment, which could have the loan into it, and then effectively leases that equipment back to the business. There's a number of advantages in doing that, not least if the business goes bust in the future, you still have all the stuff. You're kind of ring fencing or protecting the assets. You can also use it to generate another, income stream that's going out to somewhere else.
Yeah, and actually, it's very similar in our community. We've got business owners, but we've also got a lot of property business owners, and they have this top co, holding co, investment co, flipping co structure. So not at all dissimilar to that. I guess for the purposes of risk mitigation and segregating assets. Okay, great. So this is a very specific question here for you, Jeremy, from Mike. So based on this and also what you teach in the Harbour Club, would the UK still be a suitable place to create an SPV for M&A purposes?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, look, we would always recommend using an SPV in the jurisdiction where you're planning on buying your target company, because as soon as you get into cross-border transactions, there are things, there are other accounting issues that crop up, things like the transfer pricing rules and stuff like that. So you can avoid those by just having the SPV in the same jurisdiction, and then it's much easier. And in fact, although when we have a public company that's doing an acquisition, we tend to use offshore SPVs. So we used to use a lot of BVIs, but we use Cayman companies now. I actually don't know why we changed. There might be a reason, but we now use lots of Cayman companies. But when we're doing a new public company, of which we do probably 10 a year or 8 a year, something like that, we actually use UK PLCs. They have really good corporate governance. They're very easy to set up. They're very quick to set up. There's lots of good regulations around things like increasing the share capital by asset contribution instead of having to actually put the money in. I mean, when you set up a company in Switzerland, you have to open the bank account before you can form the company, which is incredible. You open a bank account for a company that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
You have to put a load of money in there. The minimum is 25,000 Swiss francs, which is about nearly 25 grand sterling. And then you can create the company with that as the paid up capital. And that's the minimum to set up a company. And lots of countries have equally stupid rules, whereas in the UK, you can go onto Company Wizard and 2 minutes later, you've got a company. So it's very, very simple. And Companies House, whilst they've tried to put a few more obstacles in the way now, in terms of you have to have this special login to Companies House now for things, it is all online. It is all very easy to deal with. So we use UK PLCs quite a lot. I've probably formed, half a dozen this year. They're often used. Yeah, you have the takeover panel that you have to speak to every so often, and there's a few other regulations, but it's a lot easier than other jurisdictions, and it's well respected.
Interesting. Okay. Right, so I'm going to try and do a double whammy here. So Ashwina and Hugh have both asked a question about how long it takes to set up a SSAS and also, the transfer of existing pensions. So SSAS is structured very like a business, and businesses are approved by Companies House, SSASs are approved by HMRC. However, it does take a bit longer to get a SSAS set up. They say that all good things come to those who wait. So if you're willing to wait, it takes about 4 months to get a SSAS created. There's a little bit of prep time and some work that needs to be done to line you up, to make sure you've got the right administrator to run it, and that the things you want to do can actually be facilitated. But it takes about 4 months, give or take, to get that SSAS created. And at that point, you can start funding it. And you can either fund it from new contributions, and Jeremy and I were touching on that earlier on in the chat, company contributions from business owners that are tax deductible. Personal contributions are also possible. But most commonly, people who've built up pensions in their lives can transfer those pensions, or at least most types of pension, into a SSAS. That could be a SIP, it could be a standard personal pension, it could be a former employer's pension, it could be all three. If you've accumulated money, you can move it. And the other great thing about a SSAS is it's collaborative. You, your partner, your spouse, your business partner, siblings, in theory, anyone you want can collaborate with you as long as they've got some familial or business link to you. So the second element of the funding might be bringing in existing SIPs or other pensions, which again takes about another 4 or 5 months. So it's about a 9-month time frame to get this thing set up. So as soon as you see SSAS is ready for you, you shouldn't dawdle, because if you dawdle, you're only then prolonging the lag time until you've actually got the vehicle up and running. And there are lots of things you can be doing in the meantime whilst you're waiting for the various bits to be, bolted together and created and funded. But it's easy to move pensions in. The only thing that you can't move are government-funded final salary pensions like the NHS, the police, the military, teachers' pension. They can't be moved. And if you've got a live final salary pension, though, there aren't very many of those around anymore. Usually from a corporate, lots of blue collar employers actually had them. Then they are very, very difficult to move. But if you've got a pot of money linked to something related to the stock market that goes up and down in value all the time, then in most cases it can be moved. Perfect. Right. Okay. So let's have a look for a question for Jeremy. Okay. So Lily actually has asked a second question here. How can you place your situation tax efficiently on UK business via M&A? Should I move the office overseas in the desert? She said.
No, so look, there's a whole bunch of tax regulation throughout the world, which can be broadly explained as the General Anti-Avoidance Regulations, or GAAR. And basically, what it says is that if you take an action only to avoid tax that has no other commercial purpose, then they can look through it and tax you as if it didn't exist. Yeah. So just sticking the office in the desert, whilst that used to work in the old days, the days of the Panama Papers and all of that stuff, it just doesn't work anymore. So if there's no commercial purpose for having an office in the Cayman Islands or in the Dubai or whatever, that everything happens in the UK, including you living in the UK, then you're going to be taxed as if you're in the UK, and they might even punish you and back tax you and put penalties on top for your deliberate attempt to avoid tax. Now, avoidance used to be legal, evasion used to be illegal, but now there's this big grey area in the middle, which is this deliberate avoidance piece, which is makes it much harder to deal with and much more arbitrary for them to enforce. So the best bet is to create a completely legal, tax efficient setup in the UK, or to leave, but you can't do something in between the two. So yeah, that would be my advice, basically, is either optimize what you have in the UK, and we've got some great accountants around us in the Harbour Club, and I'm sure wealth builders too that can help, and wealth builders obviously have great strength in SaaS and that sort of area. You can, there are still opportunities to make your life more efficient in the UK. But the other option is, the vote with your feet one. Yeah, but you can't do something in between.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Great.
Okay. So there are quite a few questions about SSAS and inheritance tax. So I'll touch on that briefly. So Huzaifa and Roy and Bernard and several other people have all asked, whether SSAS is going to be impacted by the IHT changes. And the answer is yes, it is. The IHT changes are all encompassing. Any pension that's got a value, and I mentioned a few minutes ago, NHS pensions and civil service pensions can't be moved into a SSAS, and that's because they don't have an underlying value. They have a promise of payment. If you've got a pension that's got a value and it can be left to someone when you're not here, it's going to fall foul of the IHT changes as of April 2027. So that said, SSAS is the only pension vehicle that can allow you to mitigate the amount and reduce the amount of inheritance tax you're going to pay. I mentioned earlier on that it's a multi-person vehicle. You can collaborate. You can have your generation and your adult kids, and then in theory, when their kids are adults, they can join, and it becomes this perpetual legacy that, if managed properly, rolls on down the generations. So the assets within it and any income that they're generating likewise rolls on down the generations. And you can use a really clever thing called earmarking, which in principle is very simple. You contribute money for your next of kin, your children, let's say, typically when they're adults, into the SSAS. And then you assign the assets in the SSAS that have got the highest returns to them and the lower returning assets to you. And this is an IHT play. So if you're not reliant on your pension entirely for your wealth and income in the future, and you care more about inheritance tax, then you can deliberately stagnate the rate at which your part of the pot grows and artificially accelerate the rate at which their part grows, which means that hopefully some decades down the line, when you and your significant other are no longer here and there's an IHT bill cropping up, the pot being left is much, much smaller than it otherwise would have been, because you've deflated the growth on it and you've accelerated it. So it's skipped a generation with a new contribution anyway, and then you've been able to bolster the value, which means there's less tax to pay on what's left. Can't do that with any other kind of pension, because every other pension is a single person pension. That's probably the most powerful feature that a SSAS has from an inheritance tax perspective. There are some other things it can do too, but that's probably the key.
Yeah, the only other solution is not dying.
Well, I tell you what, Jeremy, if you could invest in a business that gave, the golden, what do they call it, the elixir of life, and everyone lived forever, then you'd have an a customer in me. But
funny, I've seen so many longevity deals recently. It's a really hot topic.
Yeah,
lots of people doing longevity businesses.
Okay. Right, okay, so we've got a little bit of time left. We're going to try and get through as many as we can. So Charles is asking, Jeremy, when starting a property business, so this is about property, is it better to have an SPV or just a normal limited company? And I guess the principle might be the same, broadly for trading business versus property business. Have you got a thought on that?
Yeah. Look, the way most property businesses are set up is a propco opco model. So, when we're looking at it, we always have the business that operates in the property. So, interestingly, commercial property is valued on the quality of the lease, not by any other metric. And so, if you have an operating company, you can adjust the value of the property up and down by increasing or decreasing the rent in the lease. So if you need it to be worth less, you can reduce it, or if you need it to be worth more, you can increase it. And obviously, you can borrow money against a commercial property, a mortgage. You can take out a commercial mortgage based on its valuation. So there's all sorts of games you can play when you have a property company and an operating company that interact with each other. So that's a very and we talk about that quite a bit in the Harbour Club. We have a property split strategy that we use, which lots of businesses that are property centric, like nursing homes, hotels, these kind of things. You can have a lot of fun with that sort of a model. If you're looking at a pure like a holdco for lots of real estate, the other structure you might want to look at is a REIT, a real estate investment trust. A REIT is in the UK, it's only a notification to HMRC. So you send them a letter saying, "Dear HMRC, we are now a REIT." More or less. Don't quote me on that. You might want to get a lawyer to write that letter. But that's pretty much what you do. You write to them and say you're a REIT, and from that moment, you don't pay any corporation tax. More than 50% of the balance sheet must be real estate. You must have at least 2 income generating real estate assets in the portfolio. And that's pretty much it. So you could have 2 studio apartments that are rented out and qualify for a REIT and not pay corporation tax. And this is really useful because they got rid of the mortgage interest tax relief, which made it more sensible to stick your property into a company, but then in a company you have corporation tax.
Yeah.
So converting to a REIT then gets rid of the corporation tax, and then the extra thing, which is sorry to sound like a broken record, you move out of the UK and you can then pay all the rental income as a dividend to you tax free.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So there's a question here from Susanna about asking what security is typically needed when a SSAS provides a loan to the company. And so I mentioned a little while ago about SSAS loan back. Jeremy and I were talking about how, there are several ways for a SSAS to invest in a small business, whether you're in property or whether you've got, a more traditional trading business of any kind. And one option is this uniqueness for the SSAS to be able to lend money to the limited company. And the other is to potentially consider buying shares. And the third would be buying, commercial property, which Jeremy was just touching on there in part. There are some rules, and chief among those rules is that you've got to charge a rate of interest that is, at least broadly speaking, 1 over base. Pretty cheap money compared to, most lending organizations. And certainly if you're a property investor and you rely heavily on bridging finance, which is astronomically expensive. If you've got to pay interest, you're better off paying it to yourself anyway. And secondly, you have to pay far less, which means there's far lower cash flow implication to your business. You get to keep more of the money in the business. So for lots of reasons, using the loan back is an incredibly powerful thing, whether you're a property investor who's got a limited company or a business owner who's looking to acquire other businesses or invest in their business in some other way. You do need to give a security to the money, though. The SSAS can't lend unsecured. It has to have a first charge. But there are a number of different things that you can use for that.
So if you just set up a debenture, does that qualify, even if there's not much in the company?
Well, there has to be, I suppose, like a lot of things, there's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, right? So you've got, technically, a company can offer a debenture, and there are administrators that will allow a debenture as long as it's the first ranking debenture. So, you've got to have some structure in place to mean that anyone else who comes in next always has a subsequent debenture to you. But that can definitely be done. And if you've got a business that owns assets, intellectual property, guaranteed income streams, goodwill, all those things, they will all be used, won't they, by a tax expert to value a business. So that can definitely be used. So, using the value of the actual business to give more capital to the business is definitely doable. But real estate can be used. Commercial premises and even residential property can be used as a security.
Fantastic. Lily did a follow-up actually, which is, isn't Rachel Reeves imposing dividend taxes, so can't understand how it's tax-free via the REIT? Dividend taxes are for UK residents.
Well, look, genuinely, again, thanks so much for joining. Looking forward to getting the opportunity to do this with you again. Thank you, everyone that's joined today. We've had some fantastic questions. Wish you all a fantastic end to the week, rest of the week, and a fantastic end to 2025.